certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
The details of this trial have been equally shocking and intriguing, and for many of you listening to this podcast, it's obviously left you with sometimes more questions than answers. I'm Natalie Bongiolo, and in this bonus episode we have criminal lawyer Damien Cripps and the West Australian's legal affairs editor Tim Clarke. And they are going to try to answer some of the hundreds of questions that you've emailed us over the past few weeks. So let's get started. Thanks for both coming in. Let's get started with question one, which is from Alicia and Scott Smith. And they are wondering if we will find out who the defence will call as witnesses for Mr. Edwards. She says, I'm also somewhat confused as it was reported sometime over the last few years since Mr. Edwards' arrest and charges that his family and friends supposedly support him, but they haven't appeared in court. Have they been told to keep away?
Well, I can answer that quite quickly. No, they haven't. Mr. Edwards, his mum and dad have been there pretty regularly, certainly in the last couple of weeks. They sit together, so the court is basically configured a bit like a bride and groom at a wedding. So the victims' families are on one side of the court, and then Mr. Edwards' families are on the other side of the court, and there's reserved seating for both towards the front of the public gallery. And Mr. and Mrs. Edwards have been there very regularly, taking very keen interest in what's going on, and there's been some non-verbal interaction between Mr. Edwards and his parents as he's been entering and exiting the dock. So
does he look to his parents during the course of the day?
Not during the course of the day, but as he's exiting to go down to the custody area in Court 72, he basically walks straight towards them, sort of down the dock before he goes under into the sort of the custody suite below. And during those sort of little walks, he has been, raising his eyebrows, smiling, gesturing facially towards them. So there is obviously still a measure of family support there. Yeah.
And Damien, this question of whether the defence or will you find out who the defence is calling as a witness for Mr. Edwards?
The defence won't be required to give a list of who their witnesses are to the public or anything, but perhaps it's a case that internally the court and the prosecution might have an idea of who the defence will call, but ultimately it's not the position that anyone will find out until the defence commence their case. What I did want to say, Nat, that these questions are all fantastic questions, and the people of the world and West Australia have put their minds to some great ideas about what they're trying to find out.
Yeah.
I don't just single-handedly come up with these answers. I rely on a lot of people around me to try to help as well, and I want to say thanks to those people that have helped me over the course of this period of time to get to some answers. I also want to go as far as to say people need to remember when they're listening to these podcasts that I'm not working on this case, and I am just giving my views and opinions in relation to them. It's not legal advice, so not that I think that people would take it that way, but it's important that people understand that we're just trying to give some context to the information that we're getting. But keep those questions coming, they're great.
Right.
Just while we're on that first question, Damien, just quickly explain the disclosure parameters around a murder trial, what both sides have to disclose to each other, and the rules surrounding that.
I would say this, Tim, it's not specific to a murder trial. I think that it would be specific to a criminal trial, and if you can think about that quite logically, that the prosecution or a person has made an allegation that someone has done something, and the person who's been accused of something has to answer that charge. Theoretically, they have to get up and say, well, I either did that or I didn't do that. And if I say that I didn't do that, you have to prove, the prosecution have to prove that that's done. And then the defence then have a right to say, well, how do you propose to prove that, and that's the disclosure that Tim's talking about. That's the information that they're going to rely on, or the witnesses they're going to rely on, and the prosecution has an obligation to provide that to the defence in a defined time, generally. In some lower level matters, there's not a requirement for disclosure, but anything of a significant matter, there will be a requirement of disclosure. The defence is not obliged to disclose anything to the prosecution at all. I mean, there's some alibi witness requirements. So if it was said that I stole a bike on Thursday afternoon from the grocery store, and I was going to say that I wasn't at the grocery store, I was in fact at the library, then I would need to provide that information up front to the prosecution, so they could test that evidence before it got to court.
Yeah, which is interesting because I've been asked a lot. What is Mr. Edwards' lawyers going to do to prove, prove that he didn't do it? People sometimes find it quite difficult to get their heads around the fact that he doesn't have to. He can sit there. He can literally sit there for 6 months and say, and his lawyers don't have to do anything proactively to disprove the allegations against him. It's all on the one side, and that disclosure thing goes to that the prosecution have got to basically lay all their cards on the table way ahead of time, so Mr. Edwards gets a fair trial in terms of knowing exactly what he's got to defend himself against, but the other side don't have to show their cards at all.
So, Tim, a lot of people would be aware of what I'm about to say, but there'll be probably a lot of people that are not aware. It could be the case, quite simply, that Mr. Edwards doesn't give evidence.
No.
That's right.
And I mean, that would be quite shocking to some people to think that this is a case where this man's not going to have to say anything at all.
Yep.
And if the prosecution haven't met their threshold, why would you call him?
That's right. He's not obliged to.
Yeah, and that's the question that basically I've had the most over the 4 weeks. Or when's he going to give evidence? I say, well, he might not.
Because
then they go, why? And I said, well, he doesn't have to.
That's right.
And, the practical, conclusion of if he did is that you are going to get one of the best barristers in the country asking you very, very difficult questions for a very long time. For a very long time. I mean, it's not going to. It wouldn't. That cross-examination would not be an hour or two. It would probably be a week or two. I would think, and that's probably at the low end. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is from Sarah Keeble, and she has asked, if Mr. Edwards is found to be guilty, will he be asked where Sarah Spiers is?
This is a great question, Sarah. Thanks for sending that in. There's some relatively new legislation in Western Australia that's come into play, and essentially the context of the legislation is no body, no parole. So if he is convicted of that charge, as I understand it, he'll be given an opportunity to advise of the location of the body, and if he doesn't provide the details, he won't be made eligible for parole for the duration of his natural life. So hopefully that helps, gives you a little bit of insight, Sarah, into where that might end up.
Yeah. Okay, from Michelle, and I'm going to apologise for the pronunciation of the surname. What do you think, Tim? Grigorovich? Or yeah, Michelle, thank you. So she has the question, will the accused be cross-examined in this trial? And if so, when's that to be expected? But of course, you've actually just answered that there is no expectation for the accused to defend himself whatsoever.
No, that's right. But I think that since Michelle's asked the question, and even though that we've addressed it briefly previously, what's really important to say about that is that if he does give evidence, you can almost guarantee he will be cross-examined extensively. But also, one thing, a point that is worth mentioning in relation to that is, if he chooses not to give evidence, no adverse inference can be drawn from that.
Yes, that's a good point.
So, so in answer to that, Michelle, only time will tell. Only time will tell whether he'll be cross-examined.
Yeah. So that basically, Damien, means the judge cannot think of him negatively for not wanting to give, whatever evidence he had. The judge has to remain completely neutral and not draw, think bad things of Mr. Edwards because he chooses his right to silence. Yeah.
David Lee has asked us, in relation to not being able to try Edwards again if he is acquitted, then later find Sarah Spiers' body with all sorts of evidence on her, Should they drop the charges for Sarah's murder and just continue with the charges for Jane and Kira? And he's written after that, bit of an insurance policy.
Well, that's a good question, David, especially on the back of the conversation that we had the other day about what would potentially happen if he was acquitted. Mr. Edwards was acquitted of the murders, and then another body was found later. In relation to this, I think that it's a bit of a long bow to draw to couch it in the terms of an insurance policy, but I think the listeners would understand what that means. And essentially, it's a matter for the DPP at this stage. It's obviously they've got all the information before them, and that will be decided in accordance with what the DPP prosecution guidelines are. The state is always at liberty to discontinue a charge if they see fit, but it's a matter for them. So, good question, David, but it's just likely it's not something we can really answer to definitively from this position.
Yeah, and of course it's tricky at the moment because, it's all hypothetical at this stage as well, isn't it? Should this happen and should that happen, then what would happen? Tamara Cowan has asked, well, she actually says she has a burning question for many years that she hopes that you can answer. If this public servant, Lance Williams, who was the main suspect and the centre of the Macro Police Task Force for so many years, could the police not have eliminated him right from the beginning by comparing his DNA to the DNA found under Kira Glennon's fingernails?
Timing there. So what we found out during the course of the trial so far is that DNA under Kira's fingernails wasn't discovered until way down the track in the investigation. And from memory, I think that Mr. Williams had been ruled out as a suspect by the time that DNA was basically found to be under Kira's fingernails, and it matched other evidence, as we've sort of discussed quite fully over the course of the podcasts. What could have happened if that hadn't happened was when that DNA was positively identified, they could have then gone back to Mr. Williams and ruled him out categorically, because we now know, or the allegation is, that that DNA sample matches a completely different person, being Mr. Edwards. So, I mean, it's a great idea. I hope Tamara's got some sort of investigative role wherever she may be, because that's the way that good investigators think. But as I say, I think the timings had played out that Lance had been ruled out by the time that DNA had been positively identified.
And I think that sort of answers the second part of her question, which is she asks, did police know early on in the investigation that the DNA found on the Karrakatta rape victim matched the DNA found under the fingernails of Kira Glennon? But again... Yeah,
that's timing from memory. I think it was around 2009 when that match was made, but and then the investigation continued for many more years, obviously, before the kimono was brought out of storage and all the pieces came together towards the arrest and the charges.
Tim, just on the topic of DNA, people love DNA. There's millions of TV programs made about DNA because people are obsessed with it.
Yes.
In my experience, Tim, have you ever seen a DNA report?
Briefly, and it was another language basically. I did have a look at one briefly by one of your colleagues and legal colleagues, and I did not envy them at all having to make head nor tail of it.
Well, it's just for the listeners. It's a relatively new concept for me too, reading DNA reports, but since I've started reading them, what I've discovered is they say things like, the suspect is 100,000 times less likely to be this person. So, and this is not to do with this specific set of circumstances that Tamara's asked about, but I think that it's important for listeners to understand that when DNA reports are provided, they're not always that helpful. Sometimes they're so open-ended about what the DNA actually means that they're not necessarily that helpful. So with the DNA that was found under Chiara's fingernails, potentially, I haven't seen the report, but potentially that report might have come back and said, in relation to, and I understand there wasn't anything said about Mr. Williams, but potentially might have said something like, Mr. Williams is 100,000 times likely to be the person whose DNA. So it doesn't actually pinpoint him down.
No, it could never. They never say 100%. They always, as Damien says, they always give this sort of massive figure. And in Miss Barbara Gallo's opening, she mentioned the figure of Mr. Edwards being 80 million times more likely to be the depositor of that DNA than anyone else or any other male. So that's the odds that they're saying, but that doesn't. 80 million to 1 is they're long odds.
So
but it's not guaranteed, is it? It's not
guaranteed. So what would be really interesting for the listeners to think right now is put yourself in the position of a person making a legal decision about whether this person was guilty or not, and then say something like, this person is 80,000 times more likely to be a contributor if. Now, does that get you beyond a reasonable doubt and take into all the other legal concepts, innocent until proven guilty, all those? It becomes an extremely difficult piece of evidence to measure in.
Yeah, it's very complex, and this is why forensic scientists are great mathematicians.
Yeah, and this DNA portion of the trial is going to be, I mean, there's going to be 3 layers to it. There's going to be the actual DNA evidence itself. There's going to be the issue about possible contamination, and then on top of that, we've got the personality around the DNA of Mr. Laurie Webb, who was at Path West at the time, who departed his position at Path West, a very senior position at Path West, under a cloud, and he was a very important part of the handling, particularly of that crucial fingernail evidence when it went over to America. And went to the FBI. So that's all to come. And it is fascinating. It's going to be complicated, but it is a fascinating subject for criminologists and journalists and lawyers and your man on the street.
I suggest anyone who, I'm thinking that our listeners are probably keen CSI viewers as well by the sounds of their questions. Gemma Guilford has a question that popped up from the last day of the trial, and she is wondering if a possible explanation for the 2 different cars that Chiara was seen getting into could be that she initially went to get into the Ford, but for some reason changed her mind, got out and kept walking to then get into the Commodore. Would this be possible in terms of timing, witness evidence, and where she was along Stirling Highway? So this is that conflicting evidence we heard yesterday about 2 types of cars that Chiara was seen leaning over.
Yeah, nice idea, but the fact was that, they basically kept the Berger boys to the end because they were the last persons to see Chiara, and they were also probably the most reliable witnesses, or the witnesses that say they'd seen the most. And they saw, or they said, and that backed up what other witnesses had said, that there weren't that many cars on Stirling Highway at that time of night. And this white car was quite distinctive to the other witnesses, and no one else had seen another car stop, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So what we drew, or what I think the prosecution was trying to draw together with all those 12 sightings, was a general consensus, if you want, of what had happened. And I described it as an outlier, and I think that's what it was. And the fact that this gentleman that was talking about Fords works with Fords and does work with Fords, I got the impression that memory might have just been skewed over the years, rather than him seeing possibly another car. But I mean, once again, like DNA, we're never going to know categorically, because there is no vision, even though the police desperately tried to set up a camera on Bayview Terrace to get vision of cars. But I think what Justice Hall will do is take a sort of general consensus and a median line through all that evidence to maybe come to some sort of conclusion.
Yeah.
One of the roles that he'll go through in that process too is making an assessment about what he thought the credibility of the witnesses were.
Yes.
Yeah.
It might be the case they simply forgot, or they couldn't recall, or what the case is. So that's something that it's just another one of the things that gets
Yes.
added to his list of jobs to do
God.
in this process.
Yeah, and that's obviously usually what a jury's job is there to do, and a jury is every jury is instructed not just to take notes and verbatim write down what the witness is saying, but view them, their body language, the way they gave their evidence, their confidence or lack of it while they were giving their evidence, to basically get a holistic picture of that witness, and not just the words on the page, from the transcript of what they said, but how they said it, and the way they said it.
Yeah, one of the things, Tim and Nat, that always amazes me about people who have the ability to do that is not only the factors that Tim's just raised there, but cross-testing in your own mind, not in the trial process, about whether what that person said matched up with what that person said, matched up with what that person said. So you might have one witness that gives one piece of evidence that you're thinking their credibility was quite good, they said some really relevant things, but it just doesn't match up with what 4 other people said.
Yes.
So it just keeps the list of things that the judge has to do just keeps piling up.
One listener actually asked us how the judge keeps a track of that, and whether there's some kind of U-Butte Excel spreadsheet where he can cross-reference everything.
Well, it's likely that each judge would have their own personal techniques. I mean, I think lawyers have their own personal techniques, journalists have their own personal techniques. You go to an educational place and they'll teach you some techniques about how you could do that. But I would have thought that the mind that's operating at the top of this trial is one of the most efficient and powerful minds. So far be it from me to try to even imagine how he does it.
There's a second part to Gemma's question, which also relates to this discrepancy in evidence yesterday. One of the people who saw a car didn't see a Telstra logo on it. This is one of the Burger Boys. She's asking, is the lack of evidence of a Telstra Telecom logo on the car seen a real issue for the prosecution?
For that one witness, well, I mean, it might well be. It just goes to Damien's point there about powers of recall and how reliable you thought the witness was. And as we discussed yesterday, his other detailed recall of the car that he saw, which I believe is going to become very relevant further down the track when we hear more evidence about the car that was Mr. Edwards owned at the time, and the police were somehow able to track down in Chidlow, which is a hills community way out of Perth. They found the actual car. I think that evidence will become more important once he's heard about that car in particular, and the way he'll be able to cross-reference that. And there've been so many sightings of cars that we've heard about over the last 3 weeks. Some with the Telstra Living Witness, some saw a Telstra logo, some didn't. And so, as Damien just said again, it's one of the thousands and thousands of jobs and decisions and mental juggling acts that Justice Hall's gonna have to do over the next few months, and then when the trial's actually and the evidence is finished, once he's making his decision.
Tim, one of the fantastic things about a lawyer like myself coming into the forum that you wonderful people work in is that I'm not required to present evidence when I'm going to put something forward. So what I was going to say about what we were just discussing then is that there has been studies done which show that numerous studies, and I haven't got one to hand, that show that people simply forget things. They just and I think we discussed it earlier on in the season of the podcast, Nat, that one person says he arrived in a blue car, and then someone who's not an opposing witness, or he arrived in a red car. Now, only one of those people is right. So what we're talking about here is a witness who's otherwise pretty reliable, but we're talking about a Telstra logo, the dimensions, a tiny detail.
From 20 years ago.
And that's, from 20 years ago. So we're not even talking about the colour of the car. We're talking about a sidecar notation. So it's simply, it's in answer to the question, it's simply possibly not, doesn't carry that much weight.
And it depends on what you happen to focus on at the time. As we talked about, maybe the female witnesses are looking at what the the person is wearing, and the males are looking at the cars, and
And add on top of that several libations earlier in the evening and a very nicely cooked burger, and that's flippant, but that your list of priorities at that time of night, might not be thinking that I got to take in every detail of this car because it might become crucial 23 years later. That's absolutely what he wasn't thinking at the time.
Tim, you'll have to excuse me. You have to help me out. And what is libation?
It's a drink, Damien, as you well know.
I had no idea. And I'm not being disingenuous.
We've got a question here from Karen Hughes, and I think I may have caused some confusion here for Karen, so we'll answer it anyway. Karen has asked, given the high-profile nature of the crimes, why is the case heard in district and not Supreme Court? And I think, Karen, originally I had been saying that Tim was calling in from the district court, but Tim, you can explain that was physically from the Supreme Court.
Yeah, very quick answer to that. It's the district court building that it's been heard in physically, but it's a Supreme Court sitting. And the only reason for that is that the district court building in Perth, that's where the biggest court that can hold a trial of this magnitude is situated, on the 7th floor. And so that's what it was. So that was strictly correct, that I was calling in from the district court building. But as one of the court staff kindly pointed out to me, that it's a Supreme Court matter, and so it was, strictly speaking, I was calling for the Supreme Court as well. So I can be at two places at once.
And doing more than two things at once as well. We've had one question just come through right now as we're speaking, from Loretta Goldstraw, and she asks, if this man did kill these beautiful women, what sort of punishment should he receive?
Well, it's not for us to decide.
No, and I really wouldn't want to go there.
It's not. But how do people know when we're recording this podcast to actually email in at the exact time? The answer to that question can be found in a person's own mind. Because the question was, what should that punishment be? And my suggestion to listeners would be, it's a great question to ask yourself. In your mind, what is it that you think the punishment for these crimes should be if this person was convicted of all these? And then go to the Western Australian Sentencing Act, check the criminal code and see if you can find out, because obviously, like you said, Nat, a lot of people are listening as CSI buffs and they're interested in all of this stuff. You can go online and you can find the current acts which set out what the maximum penalties are for any crimes in Western Australia, and then you could test it against some of the sentencing principles in the Sentencing Act. But unfortunately, Tim, I'm going to sit out trying to give an answer to that question.
Very wise. So the way I'll answer it now, just very briefly, before Mr. Edwards' trial started, Justice Hall sat on a sentencing of another very, very serious, I mean, all murders are serious, but a particularly serious murder in Western Australia involving a man who'd killed multiple members of his own family. Justice Hall, in that case, and I stress in that case, handed down a life without parole, basically a whole life term, which is only the second time that's ever been handed down in Western Australia. Not that I'm saying that in any way relates to his sentencing exercise here, if that even arises, because we don't know yet. But all I would say is that Justice Hall, in that case, handed down the most serious term that you can possibly hand down in Western Australia, and so he has done that in the past. And when the time comes, what that will be, I mean, only Justice Hall will know, and only Justice Hall should know, and it is only up to him. And speculation about what it might be is probably not helpful at this stage of the process.
Yeah.
Another difficulty that arises on those issues there, Tim, is that these crimes are alleged to have taken place a long time ago. The sentencing provisions change all the time. And obviously Justice Hall will be dealing with these matters if a conviction arises under the current regime, and that provision that you've just talked about is a relatively, well, as you said, it's the first time that it's ever been handed down in Western Australia where parole's not available. So there's a lot of things to consider in relation to sentencing moving forward, if that's something that comes up.
Yeah, but a long way to go before that.
So, Loretto, we'll leave that one with you, and you can do some homework and digging for yourself on that one. The last question is from Winand Visser, and Winand asks a general question. One of the most pertinent legal premises is that a person is presumed to be innocent until found criminally guilty beyond reasonable doubt. Why then must such a presumed innocent person be financially burdened with bond, bail, or risk staying jailed until the case is finalised? How do these two legal tenets gel?
Well, that's an expansive question. There's a lot of balls in play, if I could put it that way, Nat, in relation to that. There's a lot of considerations. Primarily, if I understand the way that question is set up, it's about whether somebody gets bail or whether somebody doesn't get bail.
Why they should be in jail if they're presumed innocent until proven guilty.
So all of that is dealt with in the Bail Act, and when a judiciary or someone is giving consideration to whether somebody gets bail, I'm not talking about this case specifically, there's numerous considerations, and what was really well raised by Wynette in that question is why then must such a presumed innocent person be financially burdened with bond, bail or risk staying jailed until the case is finished? A balance against that is, considering the seriousness of somebody's alleged offence, why then should the community be exposed to the risk of them doing something else? I mean, you can just see how many questions could be raised that a magistrate or a judge has to consider when considering those those factors. But it's a great question, because as a defence lawyer, that's the question I'm constantly asking. Why should this person, if they're presumed innocent, be held in custody? I think it's really important to raise that it's a different premise for murder, for a charge of murder. It's a different premise, but the way that question was canvassed, I think that there was a general element to it.
Yeah. And murder, as David says, that's a sort of charge on its own, and so bail in that in murder cases is treated differently. For instance, on the vast amount of criminal charges in Western Australia, you can get bail by a magistrate, but in murder, only a Supreme Court judge, the highest jurist in the state, can grant bail on a murder charge. They're rare. They do happen, but that they are rare. And as Damien said, it's a balancing act. It's a balancing exercise. The liberty of one person who is presumed innocent right up against risk to the community of them being in the community, and the seriousness of the charges do weigh quite heavily on judges and magistrates when they make. In fact, it's basically the top of the wazzer. The very first and very last thing that they consider is risk versus liberty, and I mean, in this case, Mr. Edwards never did apply for bail, and it would have been in my opinion, it would have been a hell of a task to try and get him bail, given the length of time that he had been in the community after he's alleged to have committed the crimes.
Tim, in WA, bail for murder is only available in exceptional circumstances, and that's despite the presumption of innocence. Allegations, said to be so serious that it's not in the public interest, but it is in the public interest to ensure that the trial is protected and the people of the community are protected as well.
And the time to trial as well. That's also taken into account, and was taken into account by Justice Hall when he delayed the trial. We've discussed when it was due to start in June and July, and then he had to put it back to November because of that evidence, that new evidence that came up, and that was at the very forefront of his mind then was, well, Mr. Edwards has already been in custody nearly 2.5 years, which is an exceptionally long time to trial anyway, if I push it back further. But on that balancing act, he decided, I will let in the new evidence, I'll draw the line in the sand, and I will set a new date. But that date was pretty much set in stone, and that was pretty much the date that we started.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for those very elaborate answers. And listeners, we hope that that's cleared up some of your questions and thoughts on the case. And thank you for the feedback. We appreciate it. We'll still be checking emails over that Christmas break, so you can contact us on claremontpodcast at wanews.com.au. As we've said, the trial resumes Monday the 6th of January. We'll be back then with daily podcasts. In the meantime, stay tuned for any bonus episodes that we'll be dropping in, and we'll chat to you all in the new year.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.